Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we have another 2 days of spoilers crammed into one video. This is day 4 and day 5. Tons of crazy spoilers dropping for Duskmourn. We're going to get right to it because we do have a lot to get through today since it's 2 days compiled into one. Before we do, really quick, make sure you hit that like button and like the video. It helps the video get out to so many more people, and I really need your guys' help with that, so if you could hit that like button, I would appreciate it so much. Also, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy spoiler content on the way. Tons of crazy deck techs that I still have yet to upload for Bloomburrow. And we've got some ridiculously crazy ideas already that I've been brewing up here for Duskmourn. We are going to be a part of the early access event for Duskmourn on September 18th. I'll be streaming for 24 hours straight, and we'll be coming up with a ridiculous amount of crazy new standard brews, and all of that stuff will be going right up on the YouTube as quick as I can get it up there. So look forward to all of that. Subscribe, hit the like button, do all the stuff. Now let's dive into the cards. First up, we've got Skull Snap Nuisance, a 1/4 insect skeleton with flying for 2 mana in the colors of Dimir. It has the Eerie ability, so whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you get to surveil one. I actually kind of love this card. The fact that it's a skeleton is amazing. If you guys have played Skeleton Tribal at all, or seen it on the MTG Arena ladder, you know how crazy it can be. Pairing this with Case of the Stashed Skeleton or Corpses of the Lost, which are enchantments that make skeleton tokens, they come into play as enchantments and trigger the Eerie ability, let you surveil one, but also create even more skeletons. This thing gets the buff from Corpses of the Lost, becomes a 2/4 flying haste monster for just 2 mana, which is insane. Being able to surveil with this is actually really good with that card, because if you dump a permanent into your graveyard, you can trigger the Corpses of the Lost and get to return it to your hand at the end of turn. So I definitely want to start brewing skeletons again as soon as this set drops, and I think this card is going to be a key part of that. Some kind of skeleton enchantment deck. It's going to be awesome. We're going to do it for sure. And even in Limited, I think this card looks awesome. Super excited about it, but we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Dashing Bloodsucker. This is 1 black and 3 for a 2/5 vampire warrior with Eerie. So whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, Dashing Bloodsucker gets +2/+0 and gains lifelink until end of turn. This is kind of meant to be a meat and potatoes card for Limited if you're in like the Eerie deck, the Rooms Enchantments Matter type deck. This can just consistently become a 4/5 lifelinker for 4, which is really nice. It's never going to see play in Constructed, it's just too expensive, but it could be pretty impactful in Limited, just depending how cheap enchantments end up being, how prevalent rooms end up being, and how easy it is to trigger these Eerie abilities. So nice to see another vampire. We don't see a lot of vampires these days. We had most of the good vampires rotate out with the Innistrad sets, so it's cool that we're getting a taste of some new vampires here. But next up, we've got Orphans of the Wheat. Children of the Corn, anybody? We're definitely going to brew a Children of the Corn deck. We have to, right? This is a 2/1 human for 1 white and 1. Whenever Orphans of the Wheat attacks, you tap any number of untapped creatures you control, and Orphans of the Wheat gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature tapped this way. This is a really good way to build a sort of build around Survivor deck, where all of the creatures with the new Survivor ability are things that get some kind of benefit for being tapped at the start of your second main phase, and usually that's going to happen by them surviving combat, which is why it's called Survivor. But having something like Orphans of the Wheat, where you can tap all of those creatures without risking them in combat and without them dying, just to buff up the Orphans of the Wheat, and now this can swing in as one huge creature, and all of those other creatures are now tapped, and their Survivor abilities can trigger on the second main. Being able to do that multiple times in a row could get you an insane amount of value. I think this card is gonna be sort of the backbone behind a Limited archetype that does exactly that. The real question is it going to be good enough for Constructed? And the answer to that lies in just how good Survivor ends up being. If there's enough really good Survivor cards and Survivor support where the Survivor archetype can actually exist in Standard, this card could be a key part of that, and it could make for a really fun, really powerful budget brew, depending on what those cards look like. So, excited to see where this one ends up. But next up, we've got Tunnel Surveyor. This is 1 blue and 2 for a 2/2 human detective. When Tunnel Surveyor enters, you create a 1/1 white glimmer enchantment creature token. This is actually a little bit better than it looks. First of all, it's kind of cool seeing another detective show up for detective synergies that we've already seen in past sets. But just getting 2 bodies for 3 mana isn't that bad. When you take into account that one of the bodies is a Glimmer enchantment creature, it's actually really good. It triggers all of your eerie things. It gives you a second body, and it goes wide with an extra enchantment for things that care about enchantments. But there are also cards in this set that specifically care about Glimmer creatures, so being able to create one early on with an easy to get common in your limited deck, and then have that sitting there ready to be used with other cards that care about Glimmer creatures can be really good. So this is actually going to be a really good common, I think, just because it's going to synergize with all the things that this set wants to do. And it's definitely one of those cards that, without the context of the set, this wouldn't look that good. It would be decent, but not that good. But within the context of the set and everything that the set's trying to do, I actually think this will be a pretty good common for limited. Next up, we've got Layline of Mutation. This is the green Layline in the new Layline cycle, an enchantment for 2 green and 2. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield, just like any Layline. This one makes it so that you may pay a 𝑰𝒏𝒃 rather than pay the mana cost for spells that you cast. So if you're playing this in a 5-color deck that can get each of its colors really easily, it allows you to play really expensive spells for just 5 mana. You know, 7 drops, 8 drops, 9 drops, whatever, and that's pretty cool. That being said, I do think this is the weakest of the ley lines that we've seen. Making all of your spells cost 5 is only going to get you value if you're playing really expensive stuff, but you can't just wait until turn 5 to start playing things, so inevitably you have to play some cheaper stuff, and those cheaper spells don't really want to be cast for a 𝑰𝒏𝒃. It makes them a bit more expensive, so it's really hard to find a deck where this seems to make sense and actually fit. Possibly in the room deck, because it does let you play the expensive side of a room for cheaper, and then once that room is on the battlefield, it's not, you know, you can still pay the cheaper side of the room cost to unlock that side, and it doesn't really affect that. So I don't know, there could be some interesting uses here, but I feel like this one is meant for something very specific that we're just not seeing yet. If you have any ideas about it, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like there has to be some kind of crazy deck this is meant for, but I just can't see it. It seems like not enough value for, you know, wasting an entire card from your opening hand. So I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. Let me know in the comments if you have ideas. But next up, we've got Final Vengeance. This is 1 black for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you sacrifice a creature or enchantment and then exile target creature. This is actually pretty decent in a set like this, because we're going to see a lot of very cheap enchantments. We're going to see a lot of enchantment tokens, creature tokens that are created, these Glimmer creature tokens that count as enchantments, but are easy to kind of get as just little bits of extra value here and there on the cards that you're playing. So being able to sacrifice an enchantment, I think, is going to be a little bit easier than it normally would, and that makes this card a little bit better, especially when you consider the fact that it exiles. That being said, I don't think it quite makes the cut in Constructed, but it'll probably be a pretty decent removal option in Limited. Next up, we've got Unsettling Twins. This is 1 white and 3 for a 2/2 human, and when it enters, you manifest Dread. So you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard. And then you can turn the face down creature face up at any time by paying its mana cost if it's a creature card. So this is going to get a lot more value if it's in a deck that cares about putting things in the graveyard, or if it's in a deck that's just got tons of creatures and just very vastly tilted towards creatures more than anything else, because you'll increase the chances of hitting an actual creature off the Manifest Dread. And if you can hit an actual creature, this card gets way better, because not only do you get a 2/2 and a 2/2 right now, you get two 2/2s right now, but one of those 2/2s is kind of like drawing a free card, because it can become an even better creature later on if you manage to hit that creature. So it's kind of like getting two 2/2s, but also sort of drawing a card that you can play later, drawing into a bigger creature. It's sort of the same value as that in the right circumstances if you're playing it in a deck with a high density of creatures. And then you can also put stuff in your graveyard, so if you're in that deck where it's almost all creatures and some of your stuff wants to go to the graveyard, this can actually be a really strong card, but it wants to go in just the right deck in order to abuse that, so keep that in mind. It's not going to be a high pick, but in the right decks, you can actually pick this up late in a draft and put it to very good use. Next up, we've got Fear of Infinity. This is a 2/2 enchantment creature nightmare with flying and lifelink for 3 mana in the colors of Dimir. It can't block, so that's kind of the downside, but the fact that it counts as an enchantment and is a 2/2 flying lifelink for 3 is actually pretty significant. But it also has Eerie, so whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you may return Fear of Infinity from your graveyard to your hand. This is actually pretty nuts. It's going to be a lot easier to trigger Eerie in this set than it is to trigger other sorts of mechanics in past sets, just because almost everything in the set counts as an enchantment. There's so many enchantment creatures and enchantment tokens, and just all of this crazy synergy just waiting to be capitalized on. So being able to just return this turn after turn after turn is really good. And the fact that it can't block is sort of made up for by the fact that it has lifelink. Normally a creature like this that can't block, that can come back, only wants to be in a very aggressive deck, because you want to kill your opponent before they kill you. You want to race them since you can't block with the thing, right? But the lifelink, I think, kind of puts this in a whole nother perspective where you're not necessarily worried about racing them as much. You don't necessarily have to play this in aggro, because you're going to be gaining back life every time you swing with it, and if they kill it, you just play an enchantment or unlock a room, get it back, replay it, keep doing it. So the fact that you can keep buffing up your life total actually makes this way more usable in things like control and stuff like that. I'm excited to see if it's actually worth brewing in Standard, if this can make the cut in some kind of a new enchantment deck or enchantment creature deck. I think the potential is there because of the lifelink and the fact that it just keeps coming back. You could maybe make a sacrifice deck where you're sacrificing this to get value and then just getting it back in your hand because of Eerie. Maybe you're just discarding it for value and then getting it back. You don't even have to play it. There's a lot of potential with this one for sure. If you've got ideas about how to use that potential, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like there's a ton of it there. But at the very least, in Limited, this thing is going to be awesome because of the lifelink, and it doesn't even matter that it can't block, honestly. So I'm excited to brew with it for sure. Next up, we've got Emerge from the Cocoon. This is 1 white and 4 for a sorcery, and you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield and gain 3 life. A lot of times, common and uncommon reanimator spells, most of them are pretty used to being 5 drops, right? That's sort of the normal price that we see for a standard legal reanimation spell that can hit any big target that doesn't have restrictions. So seeing that same mana cost on a card that is now white instead of black, and seeing, that sort of mechanic start to kind of tilt more towards white than black is kind of interesting. The fact that you gain an extra little bit of life here when you play this spell is nice too. It might be kind of good in life gain decks, at least better than it otherwise would be. So if there's any kind of a life gain reanimator hybrid deck out there that's just waiting to be brewed with all of these new cards, this could actually make the cut in Constructed. It probably won't. It's probably just not enough value for the 5 mana, but yeah, I think it's going to be really cool and limited, and there's definitely potential for this one. But next up, we've got Unstoppable Slasher. This is another rare. It's a 2/3 zombie assassin with Death Touch for 1 black and 2. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they lose half their life rounded up. Now, this isn't as good as it seems. It's still really, really good. But you gotta bear in mind, they take the combat damage first. So it's not like they lose half their life and then they take all of the combat damage from all of the attacking creatures. They're gonna take all the combat damage first, then this is gonna trigger, then they're gonna lose half of whatever's left. So this will never kill somebody unless they're at 1 after combat damage. It'll do that last 1 damage since it does round up. So something to keep in mind. It is really, really good. Being able to make them lose half their life after dealing combat damage is pretty insane, especially on a Death Toucher that they're not going to want to block. But it's not as good as it appears when you first look at it, so don't lose your mind. This isn't broken. But it does have another ability that makes it even better. When Unstoppable Slasher dies, if it had no counters on it, you return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with 2 stun counters on it. So it just keeps coming back, which is kind of crazy, although it does take a few turns for it to come online. But it's still pretty cool that it just comes back, and then a few turns later, all of the stun counters are off, it untaps, and it starts going to work again. That makes this card really, really good. If the fact that it deals combat damage before they lose half their life didn't make it busted, this other ability gets it pretty close to being busted. That being said, you probably want to use this in an aggro deck, and in an aggro deck, you're either winning or your opponent's taking control of the board by the time all of those stun counters fall off. So I'm not going to really know how good this is until we can try it out, but the potential is there for this one to be absolutely insane. It's also worth noting there's some cool little synergies with this card. First of all 𝐴 is kind of nuts because when it comes back with the 2 stun counters on it, it will trigger 𝐴 and you'll get to do 2 damage to something, which is kind of cool. A little bit of extra synergy. The only reason I mention that card is there are so many cards in this set that are really insane with 𝐴, and that is definitely going to be one of the decks that we brew during early access. We might even brew a couple different 𝐴 decks because there's just that much potential in this set for, you know, enchantments that have counters, all of the impending creatures, this guy, there's just so much stuff. So look forward to that, guys. Early access, September 18th, 24-hour stream. I hope you're there for it with us. It's gonna be pretty gnarly. We're gonna tackle so many decks. It's gonna be nuts. But next up, we've got Anthropede. This is 1 green and 3 for a 3/4 insect with reach. When it enters, you may discard a card or pay 2, and when you do, you destroy target room. This is awesome as a common, as something you can just pick up really easily towards the end of a draft to fill out your curve a bit, have another 4-drop. A 3/4 with reach is nothing to scoff at to begin with, especially at the common rarity, but having this extra value of being able to destroy a room kind of for free is nuts. Granted, you do have to pay an extra 2 mana or discard a card, but you get the option, right? It's just extra options. So I think this is actually really good as a common, and I think it'll see a decent amount of play in Limited. I mean, it's not like a first pick or even a high pick for that matter. I think what makes it so good is that it is a common, and you should be able to pick it up pretty easily towards the bottom end of a draft. But yeah, just having this built-in way to get rid of a room, with seeing how prevalent the rooms are and how powerful some of them are, I think this could end up being a little bit better than it looks. That being said, it's still going to be something that you're going to want to pick up, you know, towards the tail end of a draft. Next up, we've got Grab the Prize. This is 1 red and 1 for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you discard a card. Then you draw 2 cards. If the discarded card wasn't a land, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. This is kind of cool. This is a nice little bit of value. This is the sort of twist I like to see on a common card that's doing this sort of thing, where you get this little bit of extra value. It makes this card more useful in aggro decks, when normally a card like this, you'd kind of want to jam it in control to get the card advantage. So I kind of like this. It helps make the clock lower and lets you sift through your deck for some bombs in Limited. It's not going to quite make the cut in Constructed, but still a pretty cool card. Next up, we've got Wary Watchdog. 1 green and 1 for a 3/1 dog. When it enters or dies, you get to surveil 1. That actually makes it considerable for some of the self-mill decks, like the Insidious Roots decks and stuff like that. I still don't think it'll quite make the cut in Constructed in Standard for decks like that, because there's just so many good options. But being able to Surveil 1 2 different times, both when it enters and when it dies, isn't bad. The fact that it has 3 power for 2 mana, can trade up really well, and you kind of want it to die to trigger that Surveil, and then it probably matters being in your graveyard for something like Insidious Roots so that you can exile it. All of that is kind of good. But like I said, there's just too many really good cards for those decks, so I don't think this quite makes the cut. But if it was a different time, a different standard, maybe a 2-year rotation standard instead of a 3-year rotation standard, I could see a world in which something like this is actually good enough to make the cut in a standard deck like that. So not quite good enough right now, but still a pretty good card. And in Limited, it's going to be really good, because you're going to be able to turn on those synergies for that type of a deck, that type of archetype pretty easily with this. Put stuff in your graveyard to prepare for like not Manifest, Delirium or Threshold or things like that. So I think this will be pretty decent Limited. But next up, we've got Popular Egotist, 1 black and 2 for a 3/2 human rogue. You can pay 2 mana, sacrifice another creature or enchantment, and Popular Egotist gains indestructible until end of turn. Tap it. Also, whenever you sacrifice a permanent, target opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So kind of a really bad version of Blood Artist, right? It's 3 mana instead of 2, and you specifically have to sack, not just have a creature die, it has to be sacrificed. The upside is you can trigger it when sacrificing any permanent, not just a creature. So maybe there's some kind of crazy aristocrats deck in Standard where we're not necessarily sacrificing, creatures, but we're sacrificing permanents. I could see this pairing really well with like a Nurturing Pixie deck where you're playing a lot of really cheap enchantments that make the opponent discard and stuff like that, and going wide with those, and then playing like Rottenmouth Viper, sacrificing them all to get it out for cheap. When you sacrifice all those enchantments, they'll all trigger the Popular Egotist, and the Viper coming in is going to make them have to lose life possibly, so something like that could be enough to kill them a whole turn sooner than you otherwise would. So it's possible a card like this could see play in something like that. But again, with a 3-year rotation standard, I think the card pool is just so insane that I'm not entirely sure if this actually makes the cut. But in Limited, man, I'll tell you, this is going to be nuts. It's going to be so fun. I love that this exists at the uncommon level, and you can probably consistently build around it as a draft archetype. Make like this crazy aristocrat style build where you're not just relegated to sacrificing creatures, but you sacrifice everything on your board and just drain them out. Seems really fun. So I'm excited to mess around with it with Limited 100%. But next up, we've got the Roller Crusher Ride. This is a legendary enchantment for 1 red and 2 and X. It has Delirium. So if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to a permanent or player, while there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it deals double that damage instead. So first of all, keep that in mind. You could just play this for just 3 mana, and if you already have Delirium, it comes down and immediately starts doubling all of your non-combat damage. Just period. It doesn't even have to be like from a red source like some cards that work this way. It's just any source at all that deals non-combat damage to any permanent or player is just going to deal double damage. You can even use this with battles to deal double damage to battles, which is kind of cool. But then it also has this other ability. When the Roller Crusher Ride enters, it deals X damage to each of up to X target creatures. So the more mana you can dump into this, the more you can start to just shoot damage off all over the place. And you got to remember, if you've already got Delirium when you play this, you're getting that double damage on the ETB ability as well. So if you pay a total of 6 mana for this, and you play it while you have Delirium, you're going 3, 3, 3 to 3 different creatures for 6 mana. That's nuts. But even without Delirium or whatever, you could just play this as a 3-drop. Like, even without paying X, you just play it as a 3-drop. Even without Delirium, you can still play it and do some damage to some stuff and then turn on the Delirium later. Like, there's different ways that you can, you know, sort of curve out into this and different times during gameplay that you can play it with different functions. Play it out early, and then once you turn on Delirium, you're doubling all your damage. Or, you know, draw into one late, and it's a crazy, ridiculous pseudo-sweeper. Like, I love that you can kind of scale this up and use it in different ways, depending at what point you are in the game. Definitely one that I want to explore, because I think Burn could be a real contender. I've already messed around with Burn in the past. If you guys saw my Hot Tub Time Machine deck, one of my favorites, I think I'm definitely going to go that direction again, and I think Roller Crusher Ride might be a key part of that, so I don't know, we'll see what we can do. Early access is right around the corner. But next up we've got Shrew Storyteller. This is a 3/3 human survivor for 3 mana in the colors of Selesnya, and it has survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Shrew Storyteller is tapped, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So it's kind of like a Luminarch Aspirant Light. It costs a whole extra mana, which is rough, and you have to have it tapped in order to throw the counter on something. But it is 3/3, and because there are some cards in this set that give you alternate ways of tapping creatures, it's actually pretty okay, reasonable to trigger this survival, I think. This is another one of those cards that's really going to depend on different ways you have of enabling it to determine how good it is or not. But at the very least, in Limited, this is going to be awesome. It's going to be an easy way to just accrue a ton of value over time and just build up your board into an unstoppable, crazy death machine. We'll just go with that. But we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Fear of Burning Alive. This is a 4/4 enchantment creature nightmare for 2 red and 4. And when it enters, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. So a 4/4 creature, and knock their life total down 4 for 6 mana. Not bad to begin with, not great, a little expensive, but not bad. But it also has Delirium. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, Fear of Burning Alive deals that much damage to target creature that player controls. This can get absolutely insane. If this guy's just on the table, and you just fire off a bunch of burn spells at your opponent's head, you're also just kind of nuking their board, which could be great. Again, it is 6 mana, and that is a lot. I don't necessarily think it's going to see play in Constructed because of that, but I do have a feeling this could come out of nowhere and be really, really strong and Limited. 6 drops, usually not that crazy in Limited because it does take quite a lot to get there. Usually you kind of want your 6 drops and above to beat bombs, but I have a feeling this could in some ways be almost like a sleeper bomb. Not quite, but almost. If you're in the right deck, you can just get ridiculous amount of value off this. I don't know. We're going to have to try it out. It's expensive, but it can do a lot if you plan around it. Next up, we've got Cult Healer. This is 1 white and 2 for a 3/3 human doctor. It has the Eerie ability. Whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, he gains lifelink until end of turn. This is a halfway decent common. You know, this is meant to be filler in the Eerie deck where you're playing tons of enchantments, and it will consistently be a 3/3 lifelinker for 3. That being said, you know, you're grabbing this late in the draft to fill up your curve. If you're, you know, missing 3 drops, you don't quite have enough board presence for turn 3. This can be another card you can add into your deck, you know, 21st, 23rd card, something like that. You could do a lot worse than to fill out your curve with something like this, especially if you can trigger the Eerie consistently. But next up, we've got Betrayer's Bargain. This is 1 red and 1 for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you sacrifice a creature or enchantment, or pay 2. Betrayer's Bargain deals 5 damage to target creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. I like the versatility here. 5 damage at instant speed for 2 mana is absolutely insane, and being able to exile it if it dies makes it even better. Sure, sometimes it's going to make you, you know, pay 4 instead of 2. Sometimes you're going to have to sack a creature. Sometimes you're going to have to sacrifice an enchantment. But the fact that you have the versatility of choosing the best way for you in a given situation, if you get it late in the game and you don't have anything to spend your extra mana on anyway, you can just spend more mana. But if you get it early and you desperately need to kill a 5 toughness bomb and get it off the table, especially if it's something that can just keep coming back from the graveyard and now you have the opportunity to exile it, you could do a lot worse than to sacrifice a Glimmer token or something like that and just take it out. So it's really a combination of the 3 different ways to pay the cost, plus 2 mana at instant speed for whopping 5 damage and exile. It's every little piece of the puzzle coming together that really makes this card so good. And I do think this will be choice removal in Limited. I think these are going to get snatched up really quick, because I do think it's going to be really good. I think if any one of those pieces of the puzzle were missing, it would go down in value by quite a lot. But because it has all of those little eccentricities, I do think it's actually going to end up being pretty powerful. So grab them while you can, because they're going to go. Next up, we've got Marina Vendrell's Grimoire. 1 blue and 5 for a legendary artifact, which is expensive, but when it enters, if you cast it, you draw 5 cards. That's a lot of cards. You have no maximum hand size and don't lose the game for having 0 or less life for as long as it's on the board. Whenever you gain life, draw that many cards. Whenever you lose life, discard that many cards. Then if you have no cards in hand, you lose the game. So pretty crazy. It turns all of your life gain into card draw, as if drawing 5 cards on ETB wasn't enough to begin with. Pretty nuts. You don't lose the game for having 0 or less life is also kind of crazy. You can't lose the game. You draw a bunch of cards. What am I missing? This just seems nuts. I think what's craziest about this card is the fact that it combos with Sheoldred. So if you play this on a board where you already have Sheoldred and you draw 5 cards, you'll gain 10 life off the Sheoldred. And then gaining 10 life will make you draw 10 more cards, which will gain you 20 life, which will make you draw 20 more cards. It's like an infinite loop with Sheoldred that gains you a crap ton of life and makes you draw your entire deck. Now, by itself, that's not going to be that great because you're going to deck yourself and lose. You don't really have a choice about that, but if you have any way whatsoever of sacrificing either the Grimoire or the Sheoldred at any point, you know, during the combo, while some triggers are on the stack, you could still draw a ton of cards and gain a ton of life, and then get one piece off the board before you kill yourself, and now you have so much gas your opponent can never catch up, and so much life that they can't just kill you on the crackback the next turn before you get a chance to use all those cards. So I think it could be pretty insane. You just need a consistent way of sacrificing one thing or the other. We're definitely going to have to brew that during early access. There's got to be... We're going to need multiple ways of getting around decking ourselves to make it consistent enough. So I'm going to have to get to work and start brewing that, because I think that could be a really, really crazy idea. I don't know if it's going to be consistent enough to actually be, you know, competitive in the meta, but at the very least, it's something that's going to be crazy enough we have to pull it off during early access, right? And really explore just how consistent and how realistic it can be. Just, I don't know, card's crazy. Card's crazy. But next up, we've got Savior of the Small, 1 white and 3 for a 3/4 core survivor with survival, which makes sense. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Savior of the Small is tapped, you return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. It's like a reusable Gravedigger in white, and I love it. It's got a decently high toughness, so chances are it can just swing in and survive anyway and bring something back. If you even bring just one creature back, this thing has done its job. If it dies after that, you still have card advantage. Like, it could be really good. But if you have other ways of tapping this to trigger the survival where you don't even have to put the creature at risk, like we talked about earlier, it's going to get even better. I think this card's going to be absolutely nuts and limited. Definitely a build around. It's just really, really easy to take advantage of that value. Like, if you're curving out in the early game and you're trading creatures with your opponent, your stuff's going to the grave, but you're getting their stuff off the field, and then all of a sudden you slam this, and they don't have anything big enough to stop you from swinging, you're just going to start getting everything back, and it's going to be really hard for your opponent to catch up. So, I don't know, man. We'll see, but I think this card might be crazy. Next up, we've got Stalked Researcher. This is 1 blue and 1 for a 3/3 human wizard with Defender, and it has the Eerie ability, so whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, Stalked Researcher can attack this turn as though it didn't have Defender. This is pretty par the course, especially for commons in blue. We usually get a guy like this every set, where it's a 3/3 Defender for 2, and there's some way to make it lose Defender. That being said, enchantments are way more prevalent in this set than, we typically have of ways to turn off the Defender in other sets for cards like this. So I do think it's going to be a lot easier to use this, use its Eerie ability and make it into an attacker. And that's going to make it a little bit better in Limited. It's still going to be a late pickup. You don't want to grab it early. It fills out your curve if you're lacking 2-drops later on in the draft. But it could end up being pretty cool. Next up, we've got Trapped in the Screen. 1 white and 2 for an enchantment with Ward 2, and when it enters, you exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment an opponent controls until Trapped in the Screen leaves the battlefield. I actually really like this. This is really good as common removal specifically for Limited. I don't think it makes the cut in Constructed. It could, possibly, in Enchantment Matters decks. The Ward 2 definitely matters, especially if you're jamming this on 3, because it's going to be at least a couple turns before they can finally get rid of it, even if they do have removal for it. So the Ward 2's nice, even when they do get rid of it. Well, like, it takes up their whole turn. It probably takes like 5 mana to get this thing off the field and get their thing back. So you get a bit of a tempo advantage, which is nice. What makes this card particularly good is the fact that it can hit more than creatures. It can hit artifacts and enchantments as well. And in this set, there's just tons of enchantments, so being able to hit enchantments with Trapped in the Screen is really, really nice. This is going to be one of the better common cards to pick up during draft, so definitely keep your eye on it. I don't think there will be very many left towards the end of the draft, so if you want it, you're going to have to grab it quick. But next up, we've got Fear of the Dark. This is 1 black and 4 for a 5/5 enchantment creature nightmare. That's already pretty decent for a common. It's an on-rate body for 5 mana, and it counts as an enchantment for all your enchantment synergies, for Eerie, for all that stuff. It also counts as 2 card types when it's in the graveyard for Delirium. Keep that in mind. Any enchantment creature or artifact creatures are going to be a lot better with Delirium. Whenever Fear of the Dark attacks, if defending player controls no Glimmer creatures, it gains Menace and Death Touch until end of turn. So, pretty cool, honestly. Swings as a 5/5 Menace Death Toucher if they have no Glimmers. So, I mean, if they're in the Glimmer deck, obviously you don't get to turn that on, but you still get a 5/5 enchantment creature for 5, which isn't nothing. But if you're playing against a deck that didn't, tilt in the direction of Glimmers, isn't using any of those Glimmer creatures, it's almost always going to swing as a 5/5 Menace Death Touch, which is insane. Menace and Death Touch on a creature at the same time is nuts, because it makes it so you automatically 2-for-1 if they decide to block it. Because no matter what, they have to block with 2, and no matter what, you Death Touch, and you kill them both. Unless one's like a 5-power First Striker, which I highly doubt. So, really cool ability. This is actually really good at common. You're not going to want more than like 1, because it is a bit expensive at 5. But this is actually really good for a common. Next up, we've got Balustrade Worm. This is not a common. This is a rare. A 5/5 worm for 2 green and 3. It can't be countered. It has trample, and it has haste. That's already nuts, because you can get value the turn that you play it because of the haste. You're swinging in right away when it's still a surprise, when your opponent didn't see it coming. So even if they end up using removal on it, sorcery speed removal on their turn, you still got in for some damage, and you got something out of it. And it can't be countered, right? So if they're trying to hold up counter magic to stop you instead of holding up instant speed removal, that's not going to work either. So it just has some nice little, countermeasures in place to make sure it can get you some value before your opponent has the opportunity to use sorcery speed removal. But what makes it even better is it has Delirium for 2 green and 2. You get to return it from your graveyard straight to the battlefield with a finality counter on it if you have 4 or more types among cards in your graveyard. So this could be a really good card for mono green, or maybe even other mid-range decks, because getting that initial value right away, it's swinging in for 5 no matter what. It's hard to deal with, they can't counter it, it's got trample, they can't chump it. It swings in right away, gets 5 damage in right away. Like, all of that combined with the fact that even if they kill it, you can just bring it back for round 2. I think it could be nuts. It's a little bit slow, definitely not good enough for aggro, but in mid-range decks, this is just the beats that hits right away and then keeps on coming. And I really think mono green could be a contender again, not only because of this card, but some of the other cards we've seen as well. I just have a feeling mono green's going to make a comeback. But next up, we've got Glassworks and Shattered Yard. This is another enchantment room. So Glassworks is 1 red and 2, and when you unlock this door, which you can do either by playing that side first, or after the entire card's on the battlefield, you can just pay the mana cost of an unlocked, or of a locked side to unlock it. So Glassworks itself is 1 red and 2. When you unlock this door, this room deals 4 damage to target creature an opponent controls. So it's kind of removal, right? You can just play it as a 3-drop 4 damage removal spell. That's also a permanent, has extra value you can get later, which is really awesome. That extra value is in the form of Shattered Yard. 1 red and 4. At the beginning of your end step, this room deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is going to be one of those staple cards in the room deck, in Limited specifically. The fact that you get access to this slow pinging win condition without having to waste a card, because you can just play the Glassworks side and use it as removal, is super, super important. Even if Shattered Yard was a little bit cheaper, it's hard to justify spending an entire card on something that's going to be that slow. But the fact that it's free extra value you have on the back of a removal spell is going to be really, really awesome. So I actually think this card is going to be fairly good. It's probably a little too little too late kind of for a constructed deck. That being said, I definitely anticipate there being a standard constructed rooms deck, and it's possible this card makes the cut. I don't think it does. It is a common, but it could. But definitely in Limited, this card's going to be awesome, and I'm excited to give it a whirl. Next up, we've got Spineseeker Centipede. This is 1 green and 2 for a 2/1 insect. When it enters, you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And it has Delirium, so as long as you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it gets +1/+2 and Vigilance. So it just becomes a 3/3 Vigilance creature, 4/3, that also fetched a basic land and put it into your hand. And that's really good for a common, honestly. Being able to replace itself with a land and be a very relevant creature when you hit Delirium, super awesome as a 3-drop. So you're not really going to want to play it unless you really need the mana fixing, or unless you're deep into Delirium. But if you're into both, then this is going to be really good. Next up, we've got Vicious Clown. This is 1 red and 2 for a 2/3 human clown. Whenever another creature you control with power 2 or less enters, Vicious Clown gets +2/+0 until end of turn. What I like about this card is the fact that it's not limited to triggering just once a turn. Every time a creature enters with power 2 or less, it gets +2/+0. So if you have some crazy way of making a whole bunch of tokens all in one turn, this thing can boost all the way up to like 10 power, 12 power, 20 power, whatever the case may be. That's pretty cool for a common, honestly. Obviously, that's not going to happen very often, but I'm curious to see if there is enough support for this in Limited, for this to actually do a ton of damage and be a huge threat in Limited. We'll have to wait and see what the entire set looks like after the whole set is spoiled, but there's definitely potential for this to be kind of a crazy build around in Limited, and I'm excited to find out if that's the case. But moving on, we've got Threats Around Every Corner. This is 1 green and 3 for an enchantment, and when Threats Around Every Corner enters, you get to manifest Dread, so you get to look at the top 2 cards, One of them enters face down as a 2/2 creature, the other one you get to put in your graveyard. Whenever a face down permanent you control enters, you search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This is a cool way of getting mana fixing in your deck that's not just mana fixing, that's not like a waste of a card, because you also get a creature. And that creature could get you extra value if you manage to find another creature that can then be turned face up later on. So this is pretty cool. I think this could be a staple in a certain archetype in Limited. Especially if you need the fixing, right? Being able to fix with this is nice. But being able to fix and manifest dread, I'm really curious to see if there's a deck that kind of wants both of those things at the same time. It's also cool to note that this could be interesting in like a constructed deck with like disguise and cloak and stuff like that. Just basically making it so that every time you're playing whatever you're playing, they're all gonna let you search for lands. It's possible to like really ramp up to an insane amount of lands in a deck that's focused around just manifesting dread, disguising, cloaking, all that stuff. It's probably a little bit too expensive, like waiting to start ramping and start searching for lands until you play your 4-drop is a little bit rough, but the potential's there at least, so I think it's worth exploring, and it could end up being very interesting. We'll see. But next up we've got Overlord of the Boilerbilges. This is actually one that was spoiled a few days ago, but we only ever had it in a foreign language, so I couldn't really throw it up on the spoiler video. That being said, now we finally have the English version ready to go. So this is a 5/5 enchantment creature avatar horror, just like all of the Overlords in the Overlord cycle, for 2 red and 4. But it also has Impending 4 for 2 red and 2, so you can play it for just 4 mana. The thing is, if you do that, just like all of the Overlords, all of the Impending creatures, it's going to enter as a non-creature enchantment with 4 time counters on it. At the end of your turn, you remove a time counter. Once the last one goes away, it then becomes the creature version of itself. And why does that matter? When Overlord of the Boilerbilges enters or attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target. So you can play this as a bit of an overcosted removal spell early for 4 mana. Deals 4 damage to whatever you need to. Can even hit planeswalkers, battles, the opponent's head, whatever you want. And then it sits there, and it takes 4 turns for all of the time counters to go away. But once they do, then you have a 5/5 threat that suddenly appears for no mana cost, and can start swinging in and triggering that ability every turn. And that's what makes it really strong. Being able to trigger that 4 damage to any target every single time it attacks is nuts. You can even just throw 4 damage at a blocker that you don't want to block this. Maybe it's a Death Toucher or whatever, just to help it be able to finish combat still alive, right? So the fact that it has some protection built in for removing a threatening blocker, can just swing every turn and trigger every turn is awesome. If you draw it later on, you don't have to wait the 4 turns. You can just pay the 6 mana, jam it out there, and immediately have the 5/5. So there's a lot of versatility in how it can be played. And just like all of these impending creatures, I'm excited to use it with both All Will Be One, because you know, playing it as an impending 4 for its impending cost, you're going to get 4 counters on it right away and trigger All Will Be One for 4 damage, which is awesome. 4 and 4, like that just sounds amazing to me. Also excited to maybe use it in a 5-color ridiculous enchantment deck with Zur, because you can play it as the impending, for the impending cost as the non-creature version, and then instead of waiting 4 turns, just turn it into a creature with Zur by paying 2 mana, and not only do you have your 5/5, actually it'd be a 6/6, because Zur turns it into a creature that has power and toughness equal to its mana cost. So for 2 mana, you would turn this into a 6/6 that when it attacks deals 4 damage to any target, and Zur would also give it hexproof and death touch and lifelink. This thing would be insane. And it having death touch means every time it attacks and does that 4 damage, even if the 4 damage isn't enough to kill the thing, you could throw 4 damage at an opposing Atraxa. The death touch is still going to mean that that damage kills it. And you gain 4 life because Zur gives it lifelink. Man, Zur with Overlord of the Boilerbilges is nuts, huh? We need to build that. Do we just use Zur and All Will Be One in the same deck with all of the impending creatures? Is that what we do? I don't know. I think it's different decks, but there could be a version that's just everything just smashed into one. We have a lot of experimenting to try on early access. That's all I got to say about that. This card definitely has a lot of potential. So yeah, let's do that. But next up, we've got Insidious Fungus. This is 1 green for a 1/2 fungus creature. You can pay 2 mana and sacrifice it. Choose one. Destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or draw a card and then put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. This thing is insane. It is super versatile. It comes down as a 1/2 for just 1. It's not even like overcosted or anything. And then just at any point later in the game, if you need to kill an artifact, you need to sack it, kill an artifact. If you need to kill a bomby enchantment, sacrifice it to kill an enchantment. If you don't need any of those things, but you're desperate for some kind of value, you just sack it and draw a card. Not only just draw a card, but also put a land from your hand on the battlefield tapped. It ramps you while drawing you a card. This thing is just so insanely versatile. It's going to be a very high pick in anything that's running green and limited. It might even see constructed play. Probably not. I don't know if it does quite enough for constructed, but out of all of the uncommons we've seen, this one is definitely up there on the list of uncommons that could see play in constructed. This is a good card. But next up, we've got Untimely Malfunction. This is 1 red and 1 for an instant. You choose one. Destroy target artifact, or change the target of target spell or ability with a single target, or 1 or 2 target creatures can't block this turn. This is insanely versatile. Having removal that can also just be a double spell or take away their blockers, it can be used in so many different ways. I think primarily you want to run this in a deck that can utilize that second ability, where you can, you know, change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. Maybe you reroute your opponent's removal to kill their own thing, and in a way you get rid of their removal spell and get rid of their creature with just 1 card, and you 2 for 1. I think that's the coolest way to use it. But having an alternate mode where you can destroy an artifact, or just have your aggro deck win because they can't block, seems pretty interesting. So it's another one of those cards you don't really know how good it's going to be until you can test it out in the limited environment. I don't quite think it's going to make the cut in constructed, but crazier things have happened, so it's possible. Next up, we've got Floodpit's Drowner. 1 blue and 1 for a 2/1 merfolk with flash and vigilance. Can we make a new merfolk deck? Can that be a thing? Can we do that? I feel like merfolk just really wants just one more really good cheap merfolk. Maybe this is it. We're off to a good start. When Floodpit's Drowner enters, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. Holy crap, so wait, this is a 2/1 flash vigilance creature for 2 that also taps down a creature and puts a stun counter on it? This is insane. Why don't they just make it do everything? Oh wait, it does. There's more. Pay 1 blue and 1, tap it, shuffle Floodpit's Drowner and target creature with a stun counter on it into their owner's library. So it can be permanent removal if you're desperate and need it to be. You can even use it with other creatures that other cards are being used to put stun counters on. So if you're in like a stun counter deck, you can just, even if you use this early to, you know, tap down something tiny and it's not worth getting rid of your Drowner to get rid of forever, later in the game you play another spell that puts a stun counter on some huge big threat, and then you can decide to shuffle this in order to shuffle that in. That just seems awesome. This card just does everything. This is going to be an extremely high pick and limited. Like, probably the best uncommon we've seen so far for limited, to be completely honest. This card is insane. It's removal, it's board presence, it's instant speed trickery. It's awesome. This card's awesome. Play it. If you're playing blue, just play this card. There you go. You don't have to think about it. Just draft it and play it. But next up, we've got Attack in the Box. I love it. 3 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature toy, and whenever Attack in the Box attacks, you may have it get +4/+0 until end of turn. If you do, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. The only thing I don't like about this is I wish you could choose after blockers were declared. Because if you had the threat of activation where they don't want to block it with their big toughness creature, because they're worried about you trading your stupid attack in the box with it, that would be so much more fun and create much more interesting decision making during games. As it stands, you have to choose when you attack, which means you're never really going to do it unless it could get in for lethal, right? If you get them down to 6 and then you attack in with this, well, then you activate the ability, force them to have to block with their only creature that's maybe a big creature they didn't want to lose, but now they have to. That could be kind of cool. I wonder if there's ways to get extra value off of sacrificing this and maybe bringing it back. In any decks where you're getting value off sacrificing creatures, this could be a little bit better. You know, in decks where you're able to get things back after sacrificing it, this could be a little bit better. So I don't know. Jury's still out. It's pretty decent as a blocker, right? Until you use the ability, I guess. But, I don't know. This could have been so much better if you got to choose to activate that ability before dealing combat damage, but after they declare blockers, because you kind of have to waste it a lot of the time, I feel. You have to sacrifice it if you do the ability no matter what, and your opponent doesn't have to decide whether they block it or not until after you give it to +4, so I don't know, it could be really rough, but if there's ways to synergize with the sacrifice or bring it back time and again, it could end up being cool. We'll have to wait and see what the whole set looks like. But next up we've got Head Shredder. This is 2 green and 2 for a 5/5 artifact vehicle, and whenever it attacks, you may mill 2 cards, so it's going to be really good in self-mill decks. It crews for only 1. That's what really makes you start to perk up and pay attention to this card, because that is a very cheap crew. Any kind of token creature whatsoever, a glimmer token creature, whatever, can just very easily crew this, which seems really awesome. But the static ability is what makes it go from like perk up and pay attention to whoa, this card is great. Whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped. This just triggers every time. It doesn't have to be cards that were milled from its attack ability where you mill 2 cards. Like, it can be those, but anything at all that puts lands into your graveyard, every single land that enters your graveyard is just gonna be vomited out onto the battlefield. Let me rephrase. Every land that enters your graveyard from your library. It can't just be discarded or something like that, but all of those self-mill decks that are just constantly dumping lands into their own graveyard, they're going to love this thing. Just jam it on the field. It doesn't matter whether you're crewing it, attacking, or not. Like, just all of the stuff that you start self-milling into the graveyard, just going to start coming onto the battlefield tapped. Like, man, that's insane. You could play this with Vine Lasher, right? And Vine Lasher can just crew this, and then all of the lands that you get onto the battlefield from this start to trigger the Vine Lasher. That seems awesome. This just seems great. The cheap crew cost, the attack trigger, and the static ability, which doesn't even need it to attack or be a creature at all to function, it's just all awesome. Now, how good this card ends up being really depends on how relevant the self-mill deck is, how relevant ramping in the self-mill deck is, but we've already kind of seen decks like that in Standard, and I have a feeling this is going to be a key part of decks like that moving forward in Standard, but we're going to have to wait and see, you know, testing this out to see just how good it is, but the potential is there for this to be absolutely bananas, so I don't know, I love it. But next up we have Cursed Windbreaker. This is sort of like, what is that card? This is like the other equipment that we got a couple sets ago, but a cheaper, crappier version at home. What's the name of that card? Let me know in the comments if you remember the name of that card. The one that cloaks? This is 1 blue and 2 for an artifact equipment. When Cursed Windbreaker enters, you manifest Dread and then attach Cursed Windbreaker to that creature. So look at the top 2 cards. One of them enters face down as a 2/2 creature. The other one goes into your graveyard. Equipped creature has flying, and then this equips for 3. So you create a 2/2 flyer, and then you can start moving this around the battlefield and attach it to your other big creatures to make them have flying. So I kind of like it. I think in Limited, even though this is a lesser version of Cryptic Coat, that's the name of that card. This is Cryptic Coat at home. This is a poor man's version of Cryptic Coat. This is not as good as Cryptic Coat. It does have some upsides, though, that are different from Cryptic Coat. The flying means the creature that you make can block flyers, which the Cryptic Coat couldn't do. Also, the equipped 3 means even after the thing this is attached to dies, you can start moving this around the battlefield to give other big creatures evasion, which Cryptic Coat couldn't do. You had to return Cryptic Coat to your hand and replay it in order to get it on another creature. So this is kind of cool. In Constructed, it's not going to really make the cut though, not in the way that Cryptic Coat does. But in Limited, this is actually going to be a really good card. It is a 2/2 flyer for 3 that can just start giving all of your other creatures flying after it dies. And then it has a little bit of extra value too, in that 2/2 flyer can, you know, turn up and become a much bigger threat if you happen to hit a creature. And you have a way of getting something into the graveyard when you're manifesting dread. So there's all these little bits of silver lining value tacked onto this card. I actually think this is going to be really, really good in Limited. So I'm going to pick it high and I'm going to try it out because evasion and repeatable value with all these extra little silver lining pieces of value tacked on, I actually think this is going to be awesome. Next up, we've got Saw. Did you see Saw? I saw Saw 2. But did you see Saw 2 too? A stupid joke I used to make back when the Saw movies were first coming out in theaters. I digress. I'm tired. It's taken me a while to get through these spoilers, okay? It's like 3:43 in the morning for me. I'm exhausted. We had the community night stream, and I need sleep. I need to eat, and I need to sleep. But I need to finish this first. Focus, Richard. Let's do the damn thing. This is a 2-mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0. Whenever equipped creature attacks, you may sacrifice a permanent other than that creature or Saw, and if you do, draw a card. I actually like this. It is a bit expensive. It takes a whopping 4 mana before something is equipped with this and you can finally start utilizing it. But getting the +2 attack and getting the repeatable card draw value, I actually think this ends up being really good in Limited. It's going to be way too slow, way too much of an investment for Constructed, but in Limited, being able to turn anything into a threat and then every time you swing, be able to get extra value, sacrifice your worst permanent, draw a card, and if they block the thing you attack with, you're probably trading because of the +2 power buff, and then you just equip it to something else, and something else is bigger, and you're swinging with something else, and sacking more stuff to draw more cards, you just keep going. Yeah, I think the repeatable value on this in combination with the power boost is going to be really strong. So I expect this to be decently high of a pick in Limited. It's not Skull Clamp or anything, don't get me wrong, but it's not like a first pickable by any means, but I actually think it's pretty strong. I think it might slide under the radar too, but yeah, play it. Next up, we've got Bottomless Pool and Locker Room. This is another one of the new room cards. So an enchantment room, Bottomless Pool is just 1 blue mana. When you unlock this door, return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand. So it's just unsummon. It's just unsummon with upside. 1 blue mana, bounce your opponent's creature. Not even. You could bounce your own, right? Yeah, you can bounce any creature. So you could bounce like a Nurturing Pixie and then replay the Nurturing Pixie to return the Bottomless Pool to your hand and then replay the Bottomless Pool, and you could just do that forever, and I don't know why you'd want to do that forever. That seems silly, but you could do it. I'm tired. Locker Room is 1 blue and 4 for an enchantment room. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. That seems really good too. So it's removal in the early game, and then later on you just turn your attackers into things that can draw you cards. That's awesome. This card is awesome. It is an uncommon, so it should be awesome, right? For Limited at least. But yeah, this is awesome. I actually think this will probably make the cut in Constructed. Just having an efficient, cheap, on-rate removal spell with just extra value tacked on is nuts. So yeah, I think this card is really good. It's not like the end-all be-all for the Constructed version of this deck, for the standard version of this deck, but it's definitely in contention at least, just for the sheer fact that it is a 1 mana removal spell that's on rate by itself that just has this extra value attached to it. So I'm excited to use this card. In Limited, this thing is going to be insane. this is going to be a very, very high pick. Like, if you know you're going rooms, you have to just slam dunk this. Or if you slam dunk this as a first pick, you know you're going rooms, right? Or just creatures. You don't even have to go rooms to really utilize this. It's obviously going to be really good in the rooms deck because it gives you even more rooms. But even outside of the rooms deck, it gives you removal. It gives you card advantage for all of your attackers. Like, it's just really good. Just pick the damn card and play it because holy crap. Next up, we've got Cynical Loner. This is 1 black and 1 for a 3/1 human survivor. It can't be blocked by Glimmers, which is interesting since that's like the creature token of this set that's going to be most prevalent. And then it has Survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Cynical Loner is tapped, you may search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, and then shuffle. This is awesome on so many levels. Not only can you specifically search out things you need to turn on Delirium, so this is going to be awesome in Delirium decks, but anything at all that cares about the graveyard, this is going to be awesome in. Being able to put things with flashback into the graveyard to get back right away, or just other cards that can be played from the graveyard in different ways, just putting them right into the graveyard is going to be awesome. Putting a bunch of cards into your graveyard turn after turn so that you can turn on Threshold quicker. Like, there's so many insane ways to utilize this. Depending on how many payoffs there are for graveyard shenanigans in Limited, this could actually be a first pick card. It depends, but you could enable so much ridiculous chicanery with this card if it's played right and if there's the right amount of support for it. So I'm super stoked with this. I hope there's enough support that this ends up being like a really insane card in Limited. In Constructed, it's possible that this could be nuts as well. There's just so much potential for so much value you could put into the graveyard with something like this. It is just a very vulnerable 3/1, so it's hard to say for sure if it makes the cut. But with how much potential value there could be in, you know, in Constructed, in Standard, there's definitely at least a possibility that this could make the cut and this could be really something special in Standard. If you have any ideas in particular about the kinds of things this can search up and put in the graveyard to enable ridiculousness, definitely let me know in the comments, because I know the potential's there, but I am way too tired right now to even think of what I would pair this with in Constructed, in Standard specifically. So, questions for you. What are we going to play this with in Constructed? Because I will build that deck and I will run it during Early Access. Just let me know. But we're going to move on. Next up, we've got Silent Hall Creeper. This is 1 blue and 1 for a 1/1 enchantment creature horror. It can't be blocked, just period. And whenever Silent Hall Creeper deals combat damage to a player, choose one that hasn't been chosen. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on Silent Hall Creeper. Draw a card. Silent Hall Creeper becomes a copy of another target creature you control. This is absolutely insane. First thing I want to note is you want to make sure you get the first 2 modes first whenever possible, because as soon as you make this into a copy of another creature you control, it's going to lose the ability to trigger that on combat damage. So it's not going to be able to get the 2 +1/+1 counters anymore. It's not going to be able to draw a card anymore. And most importantly, it's going to lose that ability to not be blocked. So there are definitely going to be times where it's just way, way, way too good to make this a copy of something to pass up just doing on the very first trigger. But most of the time, you're going to want to make sure you get those counters and you draw that card first. And in that way, it kind of reminds me of the black 4-drop that we got during the Innistrad sets. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but there was a black 4-drop flyer that had a similar function to this, where you could pick 3 things, but you could only pick one once, and one of them was transforming it. If you remember the name of that card, let me know in the comments, but if you can grab the counters first, after you become a copy of another creature, those counters will still be on it. So you'll be a better version of the creature you're copying, which is nuts. This card just does so much. Card advantage becomes a 3/3 unblockable, and then it draws you a card, and then it becomes a bigger version of a creature that you already have. It could be insane. I think the way I want to use this the most is in a deck where you have really, really powerful cheap creatures that are kind of like must must remove targets that have a target on their back. And then you can make copies of it not only with Silent Hall Creeper, but with like Mockingbird. It's almost like you have 8 Mockingbirds. It's almost like you could have 12 copies of really important, valuable threats. Maybe the Needlehead that we saw in the last video, where it's a 2 mana 2/2 that every time your opponent draws a card, you get to ping him for a damage. You just start making 2 copies, 3 copies, 4 copies of that, and your opponent's taking an insane amount of damage every time they draw. There's probably even better cards as an example, but that's just one example of really cheap creatures that you can copy really early in the game with both this and Mockingbird to get an insane amount of value. But being able to copy something really big with this as well could be nuts. I wonder if this isn't going to work on impending creatures, right? Because we swing in and this can become a copy of another creature you control, but the impending creatures are technically not seen as creatures yet. So I don't think so, but there's definitely some stuff we can break with this. Let me know what you think in the comments, because I feel like there are definitely ways to break this card. But even outside of just finding something very specific to break with this, it's just insane. It's an insane amount of value. It's a 1/1 unblockable that then becomes a 3/3 unblockable that then draws you a card. At the very least, it's a 2 mana 3/3 unblockable that draws you a card. And then you can just keep it a 3/3 unblockable forever and get in for 3 unblockable for 2 mana every turn after it drew you a card. Like, even that just seems insane. Without the last mode, it seems insane. The fact that it can become a copy of any creature you control is just ridiculous gravy. I love this card. We're going to brew with it. You got to let me know your ideas in the comments, because my mind is just going a mile a minute and I'm too tired to think right now. But I'm going to be thinking up stuff definitely for early access. Next up, we've got Haunted Screen. This is a 3 mana artifact. This is a very interesting mana rock. And we've seen this like Haunted Screen motif used across the entire set in alternate arts for cards. So it's cool to see it actually be like its own card. This is an artifact that can just tap for white or black mana, just regardless of anything else, which is nice. You can also pay 1 life and tap it for a green, a blue, or a red, which is a really interesting mechanic. It's sort of an Orzhov mana rock, but it's a WoBurg mana rock. It's a way to trigger losing a life in the bat deck, so I guess that could be kind of cool. Maybe we could do 3 or 4 color bats and use this pretty well. I don't know. But either way, later in the game, you can just pay 7 mana, put 7 +1/+1 counters on it, and it becomes a 0/0 spirit creature in addition to its other types. So it's a mana rock early that has a built-in way to pay a life to trigger your bat stuff or Rowan or something like that, which can also just later in the game turn into a big 7/7 creature. Sure, I love that. I think in Limited, this is a slam dunk. I think it's just an auto include. It ramps you, it fixes you, and it's not a waste of a card because it becomes a threat, and it costs the same as a normal mana rock normally costs anyway. So I kind of love it. I'm going to slam dunk this in Limited for sure, but I almost wonder if it's actually usable and constructed too. Potential's definitely there, but I'm not sure. I'm too tired. So we're going to move on. Vile Mutilator. This is a 6/5 demon for 2 black and 5, which is super expensive. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature or enchantment, which makes it even more expensive. But it's a 6/5 flying trampler, and when it enters, each opponent sacrifices a non-token enchantment, then sacrifices a non-token creature. So this is basically Invoke Despair on a body, right? You get a 6/5 flying trampler, and they lose an enchantment, and they lose a creature. It's an automatic 3-for-1. Well, you have to sacrifice something when you play it, so it's not an automatic 3-for-1, right? It's kind of a 3-for-2, in a way. But in Limited, this is a crazy game-ending threat. This is almost a bomb by itself. It's a bit expensive. But now I'm super curious about how deep the Reanimator decks can go, specifically for Limited. So this guy in particular would be absolutely insane if you can find an efficient way while curving out to just bring him back from the graveyard directly onto the battlefield, because if you put him into play by some other means other than just actually hard casting him, you don't have to pay the additional cost of sacking an artifact, a creature or an enchantment, which can make it way, way better. If you can get this out like for 5 mana on turn 5 as a 6/5 flying trampler, you don't have to sacrifice anything and they have to sack an enchantment and a creature, that's bananas. So I really, really hope there's enough consistent Reanimator, you know, payoff, fuel, if you will, for being able to consistently get something like this into play, because this could be super fun and limited. I'm really pulling for that deck to be a real thing, because this just looks awesome. I'm excited. Invoke Despair on a stick. I hate Invoke Despair, but this card is way more fair. It is not busted. You have to jump through hoops in order to get the value, which is exactly what I think Invoke Despair was missing. The thing I always hated about that card, it was automatic 3-for-1 value with no brain. You could be the dumbest Magic player in the world, you can't screw it up. You just play it, and it doesn't matter what your opponent does, you get 3-for-1 value. That's what I hate about Invoke Despair. This requires you to jump through some hoops, to think a little more, and to be careful about how you play it in order to get the most value out of it. So I love it. I don't know if it's going to be quite good enough for Constructed. It could be. If there's a Reanimator deck that can bring this out quick enough and gets all that value, it's possible. Again, 3-year rotation means Standard is chock full of insanely high power level cards right now, so I don't know if it makes the cut, but the potential is at least there. I just love this card. It's very cool. Man, I'm really hoping Reanimator can be a thing in Limited. But next up, we've got the last card of today, and this is Omnivorous Flytrap. 1 green and 2 for a 2/4 plant with Delirium. So whenever Omnivorous Flytrap enters or attacks, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures. Then, if there are 6 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you double the number of +1/+1 counters on those creatures. So not only does it have Delirium, where it can shoot 2 counters off to whatever creatures you want, but it's kind of got Super Delirium, where it then doubles the counters. That seems crazy. And not just to one creature, right? You can put 1 counter on one creature, 1 counter on the other, and then if you have Super Delirium enabled, each of those creatures gets to double their counters. That seems bananas. We've already seen a decent amount of support for +1/+1 counter decks. We've got the Collector's Cage, we've got the Innkeeper's Talent, so it is very possible that +1/+1 counters decks could be put over the top in Standard with a card like this, especially with that doubling mechanic. That seems nuts. What I really wonder is, can we build an Insidious Roots decks with this? And I'm of two minds with it. On the plus side, this counts as a plant, and Insidious Roots is constantly putting counters on all of your plant tokens, or all of your plants in general, so Insidious Roots will put counters on the Flytrap. And if you put counters on your Roots tokens with the Flytrap, it can double the counters on those tokens. And those plant tokens can get a ton of counters off Insidious Roots to begin with, so you could just astronomically increase the number of counters on those tokens. So there's a lot of potential payoff with something like this in a Roots deck, and just it being a plant by itself to be able to get counters from Roots is nuts. That being said, it requires Delirium to trigger, whereas Roots decks really wants you to double down on having as many creature cards as possible, because you need to be removing creature cards from your graveyard in order to trigger the Roots. So I'm not quite sure if you can have enough creature payoff for Roots while also being able to consistently get Delirium, let alone Super Delirium, in your graveyard, keeping those multiple card types in your graveyard to keep it turned on. So it'll be a fine balance to try to walk in order to make a card like this work in a Roots deck, but if we can pull it off, I think it could be cool. And there is some cross-pollination we can do. There are certain cards that are artifacts and creatures, things that we can remove with Roots to trigger it, but can also count as another card type while it's in the graveyard for Delirium, for Fly Trap, things that are enchantments and creatures, you know, stuff like that. So, you know, even just self-milling an Insidious Roots counts as having an enchantment in the graveyard to help with Delirium. So there's definitely potential, but I don't know for sure until we see the whole set. I'm hoping so because I love Roots, and any new way to kind of take that deck in a different direction seems super fun. And I just want to see a really giant omnivorous fly trap. That could be super awesome. But that's the last card of the day. Thank you so much for sticking it out with me. I am exhausted, but we got through them all. So many cards. We're gonna hit the ground running and make sure we do the next spoiler video as just one day, because stacking up 2 days on one spoiler video has been exhausting the last couple spoiler videos, and I'm gonna try my best to get back to just one spoiler video every single day, going over that day's spoilers. And you know, we can stay caught up that way, I think. But if you haven't already, make sure you like the video, help me get it out to more people, because these videos take a ton of work. Like I said, I'm staying up to like 4 a.m. right now recording this, and I'm exhausted. So if we can get it out to that many more people, I would super appreciate it. So smash that like button for me. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Spoiler content on the way, tons of crazy deck techs on the way. Don't forget about early access on September 18th. 24-hour stream. We're going to be trying so many ridiculous decks. They're all going to come up on YouTube in the days following that. The first one is actually going to go live the very same day as early access. I do have a pretty much full-time editor now in Fingon. He's helping me out with edits, so we're going to make sure we get that first deck tech up right away the same day as early access, and then at least one deck tech every single day from that point on with all of the crazy decks that we're going to try during early access. So look forward to that. But if you want to see it live, like I said, 24-hour marathon stream on Twitch. So join me over at twitch.tv/quarantine_Capricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. I'm barely alive. I'm too tired. I need to go to sleep. So I'll see you tomorrow with more spoilers. I'll see you then. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Wonders of the First. Wonders of the First is a brand new collectible card game similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, featuring a unique action-based resource economy that helps avoid pitfalls like Mana Flood or Mana Screw, and a battlefield containing multiple realms that unlock over time as you fight for control of the stones. The first 400 card set is called Existence and will launch to retail in the fall, but playtest team starter kits are available to order now. And they haven't forgotten about all you collectors out there. The game contains alternate borderless art variants, as well as highly sought after limited edition numbered prints, culminating in a one-of-one stone foil. And the best part is that the developers have a community-first approach, with 8 print-and-play decks available on their website, as well as a version of the game available on Tabletop Simulator, all for free. For more information, be sure to check out wondersccg.com today. That's wondersccg.com. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there, and if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.